What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I hope you're all doing well today. For this episode, I'll be covering all 8 bosses of the new Megadungeon, Tazavesh the Veiled Market. If you need more insight on how to open up access to Tazavesh, I have a video from a little while ago covering that. This video will be specifically on the boss fights in Tazavesh, and will be segmented out via timestamps so you can jump to whatever fight you need information on. I also apologize in advance if I mispronounce any of these names, as most of them are interesting to say the least. Up first, we have Zo'phex, WoW's General Grievous knockoff, being a mechanized enforcer with plenty of glowing swords and arms with which to use them. When he casts arm security, he'll literally throw his arms around the room with spinning swords still attached to them. These will deal damage to any players that stand within 6 yards of them, so move away. Whenever Zo'phex casts fully armed, his physical damage will be increased by 25%. He'll lose this buff whenever he throws more arms out into the battle area, causing more spinning armed security puddles. He has a directional absorb shield via the rotary body armor effect, so players must move to the side of Zo'phex that isn't protected to deal damage. Impound Contraband will strip you of your current weapon, pacifying you. Run in, grab your weapon to deal damage again, as you'll see a little glowing light on the ground where your weapon is. You will receive a pretty decent 25% haste buff for 6 seconds after you get your weapon back. Potentially his most dangerous move is Interrogation, which will select a random player in the group, incapacitating them in a containment cell. If Zo'phex reaches the detained player, he will deal an absurdly large amount of arcane damage to anyone in front of him. The rest of the team must destroy the containment cell, which will free the player and ends Interrogation, but when the cell is destroyed, it triggers a big AoE arcane damage blast to the group. Be ready with a magic defensive or some large healing cooldowns for this one. Outside of that, Zo'phex is pretty rinse and repeat, so let's move on to the next one. There are multiple paths in Tazavesh to different bosses, so for the sake of consistency, I'm going to go over them in the order listed in the dungeon journal, so feel free to jump around to a different point in the video if you went a different route than this. For the Grand Menagerie fight, we'll be dealing with 3 different enemies. These first 2 enemies that you fight in the encounter swap places every minute or once you kill one of them. So up first we have Alcrux, a devourer type monster. The most consistent mechanic to deal with is Gluttony, which is a blue swirly debuff that picks one player at a time and lasts 21 seconds. It deals damage to any players within 5 yards of the player with the debuff, and it transfers to the next closest player whenever it expires. This debuff is important for parts 2 and 3 of the fight, but in part 1 just don't stand on other people. Grip of Hunger pulls players in and deals big hits of shadow damage to players caught in the 20-yard blast radius. You can use a magic immunity if you want to stay on the boss, but otherwise just run out of the big circle whenever it's about to go off. Lastly is Grand Consumption. This spawns orbs all over the room periodically. They will detonate after 4 seconds and leech a ton of health off of players caught in the blasts. You'll need to watch the timing of when each orb appears, as those will be the first ones to destroy, so that way you know where to move safely. The next enemy to contend with is Acolyte. Venting Protocol will make Acolyte spew out anima orbs. If you touch these while you have the Gluttony debuff active, you will actually absorb the orb and get a 5% damage buff per stack that lasts 1 minute. If you don't have the Gluttony debuff, then you will cause an explosion of holy damage to anyone within 4 yards of that volatile anima orb, reducing damage dealt by 5% for 1 minute. This also stacks, so only touch the orbs if you have the Gluttony debuff on you, which is the dark blue swirly puddle. Flagellation Protocol just puts an absorb shield on Acolyte and starts beating the crap out of someone, hopefully it's the tank. DPS the shield down as quick as possible and interrupt it immediately, as you can't interrupt it until the shield is gone. Purification Protocol targets 2 players with a dot for 6 seconds. After the 6 seconds, the player will explode, dealing holy damage to all players within 15 yards. This can be magic immuned or dispelled since it is a magic debuff, but just move away from others if you don't have a way to remove the debuff. Ideally, when you defeat Acolyte, he'll be near the edge of one of the rooms, as this will make the last phase a little easier. Once Acolyte is defeated, we'll be dealing with Venza Goldfuse. She only has 2 moves, but the volatile anima orbs will still be spawning from Acolyte's corpse, and the Gluttony debuff is still going to be present as well. So make sure if you have Gluttony that you absorb the orbs and avoid them if you don't. This is why you want Acolyte over off to a corner, that way when you're tanking the boss normally you can be further away to avoid the orbs easier, and that way the person with Gluttony can just run out, grab a ton of orbs, and come back and deal lots of damage. Whirling Annihilation is a move that pulls you in, dealing a metric ton of physical damage every second that you're too close to the boss. Just run away and use movement speed abilities if you have any. Chains of Damnation will randomly pick a player and root them in place, so you'll need to DPS the Chains of Damnation to free that player so they aren't killed by like volatile anima orbs flying around, or by whirling annihilation. The Mailroom Mayhem encounter has some mechanics that if you fall behind can be very fatal, but otherwise are easy enough to understand. The Postmaster will throw a variety of substances out at the group, which each need to be handled in a different way. Hazardous liquids will make purple marking circles appear on the ground where the hazardous liquids are going to land. Stand in the circle and you'll catch one of them, putting a stacking magic debuff on the player that catches it. Not catching it means a huge puddle will slowly grow from the spot that deals arcane damage every second and slows you by 35% if you're standing in it, and as far as I can tell, these puddles don't go away. Depending on your DPS output and the speed that the group is going, you might not need to soak these, but you can use a magic immunity to negate the debuff, that way you can soak a ton of them, or if your group can't kill it that quickly, then soak as many of these as you can and hopefully dispel some of the debuffs. Money Order marks a player with a big circle. It does a metric ton of physical damage, but it is split among all players hit, so stack the group for this move and get ready to use some defensives or healing. Fan Mail is a heavy AoE damage cast that hits once a second for 6 seconds. Defensives or big healing cooldowns should definitely be used here especially. And possibly the most important thing to worry about is unstable goods. Explosive packages are thrown around the room. One of the mailroom chutes in the room will activate, which you can tell by this windy looking animation flowing upwards through it. Run close to a parcel to pick it up, but you will be slowed by 50% when you do so. You'll get an action button to throw the parcel, and it must be thrown in the active mailroom chute or it'll explode, dealing a lot of damage and then putting a heavy dot on everyone as well. Movement abilities like Grappling Hook will let you get closer a lot easier, so use whatever you can to make these packages move and throw them in the chutes before they explode. To enter the boss room in Myza's Oasis, you'll need to do some trading for information. No, literally, you're going to trade and then someone will give you information. In this case, we need to find the password out for the club. You'll start talking with Zydarid, the general goods vendor right in front of the club entrance. He'll have an item that one of the nearby brokers will desire. A player will have to pick this item up and take it to the appropriate broker, which will then give you another item. After doing this a few times, you'll be given the passcode to enter the club. While this is all going on, various hostile brokers will attack your party, so keep them away from the person carrying the item around the marketplace. I'll try to put like a chart and a pinned comment saying which item goes where once I have a bit more information on all the available combinations, or if I find like a really nifty or useful weak aura, then I'll link it down there too for you folks. Once you're in the club, you and your party will pick one of the 5 instruments glowing on the stage. It is recommended for your tank to pick up the microphone that's at the front, your healer to get the drums, and the 3 DPS can pick whatever flavor of instrument remaining that they choose to, as all 3 of those work literally the same. When you have an instrument, you're supposed to have a special action button that hopefully won't break and disappear like mine did in testing. If you hit the action button, you should do like a cool power slide or a big stomping effect if you're the drummer that'll hit any of these glowing circles on the ground with musical notes whenever you see them. If you use your action button and time it right, you'll gain a stack of Jazzy, which is a 1% haste buff for each note and it lasts 40 seconds. If you reach 12 stacks of Jazzy, you'll gain the up tempo buff, which is a 25% haste, damage, and healing buff for 40 seconds. You'll have various trash enemies show up on stage once your group hits at least 10 notes on the ground, but most noteworthy of the bunch is the Oasis security. These have an interruptible move, Menacing Shout, that does a lot of group-wide damage and also interrupts all casters for 6 seconds. It also has a heavy-hitting slam attack which the tank will need to be dealing with, so eliminate this ad first while avoiding all the green puddles and nasty stuff that the unruly patrons are throwing your way. There is also an ad that spams Hyperlight Bolt, so get that too if you want so you can reduce some of the unnecessary damage in the group. Eventually, after a few waves of ads, Zogron will join in on the action, and he has the same moves as the regular Oasis security guards, but also has Suppression Spark and Crowd Control. Suppression Spark is another pull everyone in type move that puts a debuff on everyone. After 6 seconds, the debuff explodes, hitting you and anyone within 4 yards of you, so stay spread out while he tries to pull you in. Crowd Control is a frontal cone attack that deflects any and all abilities used if he's facing you. After 5 seconds, he will deal a huge amount of arcane damage to anyone in front of him and knocks them back, so just get around to the behind or side of Zogron so you can avoid that. All prior bosses need to be dead to progress to this part, as you need 3 cartel signatures. Once they're all dead, go to the platform in the middle of the Lap of Luxury to teleport to Zoazmi. Zoazmi has some very unique mechanics, and by unique, I mean most likely your group is going to wipe a few times before everyone realizes how they work. The biggest thing to know is how the relocators work in this fight. These are these little moving pylon things that are all pairs. They're marked with specific shapes, like a triangle, a circle, and a square. If you run into a relocator, you'll be blinked over to the matching member of the pair. This is a very important mechanic to master, as the room will become split into 2 and then 4 sections via impenetrable walls when Zo'phex's casts Divide. These will cause line of sight issues if the people you're trying to heal are in a different chunklet of the room, and you won't be able to hit the boss either. For damaging abilities, Zo'phex has 3 of them. Quick Blade is a simple lunging attack that puts a bleed on everyone he passes through, so just don't stand on top of each other to minimize the amount of bleed damage going out. Double Technique is a move that has to be interrupted 2 times, otherwise it deals a metric ton of group-wide damage if your group doesn't, so be sure to get this one twice. This is like the one time where overlapping interrupts is actually a good thing. Lastly, Shuri is a magical circular wall that appears randomly in the room. It will slowly expand from a small circle to become a big one that fills the entire playing area. So you'll need to use the relocators to blink through to the inner part of the circle to avoid an exceptionally hard-hitting magic debuff. Being that it is magic damage, this can be prevented with like Cloak of Shadows and probably Anti-Magic Shell as well, but just keep that in mind and try not to get hit by it anyways. For Hylbrande, this fight will take a bit of coordination due to the intermission phase, which I'll explain once we get there. For now, we're going to cover the start of the fight. Hylbrande has 2 frontal attacks, with Shearing Swings being a huge amount of physical damage 2 times in a row in a cleaving motion, and Titanic Crash being a direct frontal attack that also hits like a truck and will stun anyone hit for 4 seconds. Just never be in front of the boss when these go off, ever. He'll also activate Purge by Fire, which targets a player with a big fiery beam that leaves puddles on the ground. Try to leave these puddles away from the 4 rune markings in the center of the room, as your group's going to need to be able to reach those for the intermission. He'll also spawn 2 Vault Purifiers, which will do really annoying stuff that will get in your way. Eliminate these as quickly as you can, as they will each put a 25% damage reduction buff on Hylbrande on top of dealing a bit of damage to the group, and preventing you from interacting with the security panels around the room with their other abilities, which is part of the intermission. When the intermission starts, Hylbrande will become immune to damage and channel this puddle on the ground that slowly fills up the room. Standing in this puddle does a ton of holy damage, so the goal is to solve a puzzle before you can't stand anywhere. Those rune marks on the ground I mentioned earlier in the middle of the room will now have a giant glowing colored rune above them. 4 players in the group will need to pick these up and place them in the correct security terminal to stop the purging protocol. These security terminals are on the left and right sides of the room, and there are 4 of them. If you place your rune in the wrong terminal, you'll take a decent amount of damage and you'll be stunned. So to figure out which terminal is the correct one of the players in the group will need to go to the main control panel, which is at the front of the room. They'll interact with the panel and make sure not to move, as this is a channeled interaction, and if you move, it'll lock you out of using it for a bit. When you interact with this panel, 4 runes will appear above the console, and these symbols coincide with the position that the 4 players will need to put their runes into the security terminals around the boss room. If you're the one calling this all out, it's best to let people know what order you're starting in. So for instance, if you wanted to start with the front left rune in the room, the one to the left of you at the terminal, then we would say front left, front right, back left, something like a clockwise pattern. That way, whenever you type it out or call it out, people know where to go more easily. Being in voice for this really helps a lot, but if you aren't, then just make sure to call this out in a set order so people know where to go. Once all 4 of the runes are in the correct terminals, the intermission will end, and then you're back to the first part of the fight, so you'll rinse and repeat this until he's defeated. Hopefully someone out there will make like an add-on or a week or to make this little part of the fight easier, as without really good communication, this can be kinda tricky, so if I do find something cool, I'll leave it in a pinned comment down below for you all. Next, we have Timecap'n Hooktail. This boss only has a few moves, but messing up any of them can be very fatal. Since this is a dragon-type enemy, you do not want to stand in front of or behind her, as, being a pirate dragon, my favorite kind of dragons, she has a hook for a tail. This means if you are unfortunate enough to be swiped by her stern, you'll be skewered by that hook, making you take heavy bleed damage for 10 seconds, and be unable to escape for 3 seconds. This hook swipe attack will also hit the adds she spawns during the fight, which will kill them instantly. Her frontal infinite breath attack will also kill any of the adds as well, so the goal of the group will be to position the adds and the boss so she can do most of the heavy lifting for you in terms of add management. There will also be cannon barrages to avoid on the ground, and an anchor shot attack. This attack picks a random player and they are shot with an anchor from the ship over in the harbor. This anchor will deal damage and pull you towards the ocean for 10 seconds, so run towards the shore so you aren't yanked into the mouths of some hungry sharks. These sharks are an instant kill if you're pulled into the water for too long. Lastly, we have the final boss, Solia. This is another 2-phase fight, and she transitions at 40%. For the first part, we'll have 3 main things to deal with. First is the most simple one, Hyper Light Bolt. This is an attack that will jump between players until all 5 are hit and does a moderate amount of damage. Next, Solia will summon Cartel Assassins which need to be interrupted as their Shuriken Blitz will deal a ton of damage. They will often teleport away right before they cast it, so keep an eye out for them in case they move away too quickly. Lastly, Solia will cast Collapsing Star, which needs to be handled correctly or it'll deal a ton of damage. This causes a glowing white orb to appear for 25 seconds, and it will have a circle that grows larger and larger over time around it. If you bump into the circle, it'll deal some damage, shrink the circle, and apply a debuff to the party. This debuff can stack, so be careful not to run into the circle again until the collapsing energy debuff has worn off, which takes 3 seconds. The collapsing star will disappear completely if you bump into it 4 times, or once 25 seconds have transpired. If it reaches the 25-second mark, it'll explode on its own, putting out any remaining stacks of collapsing energy it had left onto the whole group. Ideally, we found that having someone bump into it 3 times, waiting for the debuff to fall off each time in between, was the most efficient, since that way when it popped on its own after 25 seconds, it would only put out 1 stack anyways, just like if someone ran into it themselves. This also lets you have a little bit more time between the debuffs and the damage going out so you can catch up or use some defensives as needed. Once Solia reaches 40%, she'll call upon the power of the relics she has been hoarding and transform, returning to full health and gaining a new set of abilities. She will pull these 5 floating relics into the fight, and while Power Overwhelming is being channeled, she is virtually immune to damage. She'll begin casting Hyper Light Jolt, which causes these red arrows to appear on the ground, aiming at each player. Basically, just have everyone in the group stand behind one of the relics each, and the Hyper Light Jolt will bounce through all of you and the relics. You will need to hit all 5 of the relics with the Hyper Light Jolt to end this immunity phase, so hopefully you can do this in 1 or 2 casts at the most. You don't need them all hit at literally the same time, so you should see that some of them are glowing and some aren't if you hit a few of them. The ones that are still glowing will still need to be pierced by a Hyper Light Jolt, and for every time that Solia casts Hyper Light Jolt, the group takes 50% more damage from it, so hopefully you don't get too many stacks of this or it can become very fatal. Once all 5 relics have been jolted, they'll fly around the room and reposition, and the rest of the mechanics will continue. She will still cast Collapsing Star, which works exactly as it did in the first phase of the encounter. Her 2 new abilities though are Hyper Light Nova and Energy Fragmentation. Hyper Light Nova is just a bunch of circles that appear around Solia and each of the relics, so run out of them before the cast goes off or you'll take a ton of damage and probably die. Energy Fragmentation is kinda like Hyper Light Bolt from the first half of the encounter. Solia will cast a bouncing attack that hits each of the relics, and when it hits one, that relic shoots out a bunch of glowing yellow spear attacks. Keep an eye on which relic the bouncing bolt is about to hit so you know where to position yourself and you'll be fine. Getting hit by them will put a hard-hitting magic debuff on you as well as dealing a lot of damage, and you are able to use a magic immunity if you need to if you get clipped. And there you have it, folks. I hope this information about each of the fights in Tazavesh helps you get some new gear and other nifty things from this new Megadungeon. There is even more useful bits to talk about with Tazavesh that I'll probably be covering in a separate video once the dungeon is up on live servers. If this video is useful to you, feel free to check out my other ones, and maybe if you want to leave a like or a comment or something, that'd be pretty cool too. It's all tremendously helpful to the channel's growth, and I'm very thankful for you taking the time to do so. As always, my appreciation and gratitude to all of my viewers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.